Welcome to Wyoming Armory, right here in the heart and soul of American Vintage Firearms, Cody, Wyoming. Now today we're getting back to that series that we started a while back on a complete restoration of a deluxe pistol grip, color case hardened Colt Lightning rifle. Now, for those of you who've been following along, the first episode we introduced you to the rifle and showed you how to disassemble a Colt Lightning rifle. In the next episode, we took you through the prep phases for polishing. And what that means is we had to anneal all the hardened parts by putting them out in the ovens and heating them up, softening the metal so that we could polish. And then we took them over to the bead blast cabinet, bead blasted off the scale and whatnot that builds up during the anneal process. So now we're ready to start on the most important part of a correct restoration, and that's the painstaking and detailed work of hand polishing. So this might be the most important episode we've ever aired for those of you who like to work on your own firearms, because this is the part that makes or breaks a restoration, and it's really the most time-consuming, labor-intensive part of a restoration, and therefore the most expensive as well. So if you can learn to do this, you've got a leg up on firearms restorations. Okay, so here are the basic tools of the trade that we use for hand polishing. And we start off with our files over here. We've got a variety of different types of files. You can see the example here of a round file, a half round, and a couple of flat files. All of these are single cut, smooth cut files. We think that puts the best finish on when we actually have to do some draw filing, and we avoid it if we can. This 6-inch smooth cut, single cut file is what I do the bulk of my draw filing with. I just feel like I get a little better control with this. So that's just my preference. You may find with experience that you like a larger file like that. Now, of course, the next thing is just regular old sandpaper. This stuff we find has been the very best for us. This is a Klingspor. It's made in Poland. It just comes really sharp to start with and stays sharp longer than some of the other brands that we've tried before. Just a real nice paper. Might be a little more expensive, but well worth it. We stock this from 150 grit all the way up to around 1,000 grit, although we rarely go beyond about 600 grit. Okay, next up we've got some really fine finish cloth abrasive. This is micron type that goes a variety of different cloths and grits all the way up to like 20 thousandths. We use that very sparingly just at the very end for just a final touch-up hand polish. And then of course kind of use the same with the Scotch-Brite pads here in various different grits. Now, one of the most important things we have here are our backers, because we don't want to use sandpaper that isn't backed up with something. If you've got freehand, you're using your sandpaper freehand without a backer, that's where you get waves, you roll edges, and just make a mess of it. So we've got a variety of different sizes. We've got most of it wood or a composite material that if we slip, then we're not going to make a gouge. Now, a lot of people will use files, and we do from time to time as well. But if you make a mistake with a file and it slips off the paper or through the paper, we're going to put gouges in. It's going to take us a long time to get back and fix that mess. So we've got a variety of different sizes of flat pieces of wood and round pieces of wood. And of course, you can see places like in this trigger guard in here, we would need something round to get in here to do this kind of polishing. Okay, so before we get started polishing, we've got one little issue we have to take care of, and that's we got to fill this extra hole in the tang. Now, fortunately, Colt didn't stamp the upper tang, so we're not going to get into any stamping issues. We turned down just a little plug here, we've beveled the edges, and now we'll just weld that into place, and as we're polishing this upper tang, we'll take all that extra weld off. Okay, before we hand this off to our master polisher here in the shop, we'll work some of this excess weld off. You know, your weld doesn't have to be perfect, but it needs to be, you know, above the level that we started at. There can't be any inclusions or porosity in the weld. As long as we've got a build-up above the base level and no holes anywhere, and of course we can fill some of that, but a lot of times if you get some little porosity in there, you really have to grind it out and start over. So it's time for the polish on this Colt Lightning receiver, and with me here is Josh. Josh does all our polishing here at Wyoming Armory and does a fantastic job of it, does a better job than I in about half the time. So I'm going to let Josh kind of take you through his process for polishing out these firearms.
Well, we got a Colt Lightning here. Usually when I start out, I'll just look the piece over, look for any deep pitting, any spots that I really need to watch out for, any caliber markings on barrels, any markings on receivers. If we don't have a guy that we can restamp, you really want to stay away from any markings or serial numbers, stuff like that. So just look the piece over, kind of make a mental note of where those places are. And usually what I do when I start out is I'll start out with 150 grit sandpaper, and I'll go directional across the piece to try to sharpen up edges, keep edges nice and sharp, and it'll also give you kind of an indication of where you've been already. Alright, this is kind of my basic setup here. Got a vise, big bench vise. You gotta be real careful with your big bench vices if you're holding your gun parts. Like you can see on the end of this, a real thin metal part there. If you get too torquey on that in your vise, you can bend gun parts really easy in one of these, so be very careful. I like to go off your back tangs because they're usually solid. You don't really have anything to worry about. And I got a piece of leather in here in my vise, and that's so you don't put any of your vice jaw dimples in your metal parts. You don't want to be doing that when you're polishing, or you'll have a whole lot more work ahead of you. Get it kind of nice and snug in there, she won't move too easy because you do put some pressure when you're sanding. And the way I like to start out with these pieces is I'll either start out on the bottom or the top. And when I'm sanding at first, I like to use a cross sand pattern. It's just a little easier motion when you're doing some of this. Once you get that, you've annealed this and bead blasted it. So once you get that initial I don't know, scaly stuff off the top, you'll start to see the nice shiny middle underneath. And then you can kind of see if you have any pits or scratches that you need to be looking out for or trying to work out. You just work along your receiver here, starting out here on the bottom lower tang. Doing a polishing project of your own like this, you're going to use your degree of grits of sandpaper like I said before, I'm starting out with 150. And that's really your workhorse of your sandpaper. That's what you're going to use the most of. Because as you go along with your different grits, we at the shop go from 150 to 220 to 320 to 400 grit. This one's going to go up to a 600 and probably get high buff polished. You do most of your work with your 150. Everything gets progressively easier after you do your majority of your work with your 150 grit. Wondering what I'm using as a backer. Leaf cut. This one's a little worn over the years, but this is a little piece of rubber, kind of a piece of tire, old piece of tire, or old piece of conveyor belt. And we've cut into little blocks about 1.5 inches wide, 1/2 inch. I don't know, 4 or 5 inches long. We like the rubber because we can move across to angles pretty easy with it, but it still gives you a hard backing for your sandpaper. Metal doesn't work so well as a backer. A little too hard. So if you need to use a backer, you can use a piece of wood. Or if you got any rubber lying around that's thick enough, you can use that. Some of the other things that I have some popsicle sticks for getting in your tight corners. And some round dowels in different sizes and lengths to wrap sandpaper around.
Okay, so we've talked about the importance of going through the grits when we're polishing from coarsest to finest. And so we're going to start off, if we need to, we're going to start with draw filing, then we're going to go to 150, 220, 320, 400, and so on and so forth. And our finish grit's going to be dictated by the finish that's going to be applied to that part. Now, if it's going to be rust blue, it's going to be a coarser finish because we got to get that rust to adhere to the surface. So we only go to 320 to 360. If it's a caustic blue, we're typically 400 to 600 grit, depending on the quality of the restoration that the customer wants. If we're going to a charcoal blue, which we're just perfecting now, we go to a mirror polish for charcoal blue. If it's color case, we're going to no more than 600 typically. Okay. But what's also extremely important on our polish isn't just the grits that we use, but the directionality that we're polishing. Both in terms of changing direction between each grit to make sure that we've taken out all the previous polish marks, but understanding where the final polish has to go to match the original factory finish. And that could have changed through time. It's not 100% one way or the other. Now sometimes like a receiver like this 1890, most often, or most all the time, final polish was lengthwise like this. Now some of the other models, the final polish was horizontal this way. So we really have to know that what the final polish is going to be, and it changed throughout production sometimes. Now barrels, typically the earlier barrels, were all polished longitudinally, lengthwise. And then we've seen at some point, and typically around World War II, at least with Winchester, they started a rotational polish, and pretty much that's what's done through today. So let me show you about directionality as we go through the grits on a receiver like this one. Okay, so this one we're going to finish polish lengthwise. We're going to start off, because this one's pitted, we don't have much choice, but we're going to draw file this one. And as the name implies, that just means drawing the file, and typically in a lengthwise direction like this across the receiver. Now we're not going to try to get all to the bottom of those pits, it'd take forever, but you get the idea here. Now we wouldn't stop draw filing until we got all the pits out, and some of these deep ones we will probably even weld. Now when we get to the bottom of all those pits, then we start in our polish, our 150 grit, but we're going to go in a different direction. You see, if we started in this direction again, there could be some pretty deep scratches from the draw filing that are going to hide if our polish is all in the same direction, but they really stand out when we change directions. Now I really like going 45 degrees in this way, and you'll notice that Josh polishes the same way. Now if we can go 90 degrees this way, but then we really have to be paying attention to, as we go through our grits, to make sure that our final polish is going in the direction that the factory did. And if we're going 45 degrees here with our 150, get to the bottom of our draw file marks, then we'll put on our 220 sandpaper. We can go the other 45 direction till we get to the bottom of that, and then so on and so forth. And those previous marks really stand out when we're going across them. Okay, so now it doesn't matter when we get to where we're going to go to our final polish. If we've been going 45 degrees either way, we can either go lengthwise like we would on this receiver for a final polish, or 90 degrees this way for a final polish. So it gives us that option.
Here we get one of the flats. I'm just going to do the same thing we did earlier with the directional sanding. Kind of see the horse in the middle there. That's going away. Mark's going to have it re-stamped. You can see how this is pretty pitted. So what I'm going to do is go to a file.
That's at 15 years old.
Try to get some of the pits out.
The one I got was around 3, wasn't it? Yeah, might be the same set, probably.
Just trying to stay as flat against that surface as possible. Yuki, we're done draw filing this side, so we're gonna start sanding.
So Josh, how many hours did you have in just the draw filing and the prep before you started polishing?
We're about up to 4 hours now. We started around 8 o'clock and it's 11:15.
So you can start to see just exactly what kind of patience and what kind of time it takes to do this right. And of course, each successive grit that we go through takes a little less time, but it's still a painstaking process.
To do it right, it takes time.
So I want to replace it. And then the sear that was in it, somebody in the history of this thing, and these things, that unless you get the rare one that has stayed in a family, there's no telling how many owners and how much stuff's been done to them and all that. But the sear had been stoned on the engagement surface where it contacts the sear punch and the hammer. The cross section is round instead of flat. And I'm afraid by the time I get it stoned back flat, and all these things, you open the panel with the box.
Okay, while Josh is working on that receiver, we can get started on this Octagon barrel. Now we can either clamp this barrel up in a vise with soft jaws, or in this case I kind of like to use a barrel spinner that we use to polish round barrels, but just to hold on to this Octagon barrel and get good access to it. Now we've got some little tapered brass plugs that we put on the end just to protect the ends of this barrel as we clamp it up. And there we go. So the challenge with an Octagon barrel is that we have 8 very sharp corners here that we have to maintain, and it's very difficult if you've ever tried to polish something this narrow and hold everything perfectly flat on it. And that's what we have to do. If we start rocking, rotating at all, then we're going to round off those corners and it's going to look terrible. And most folks, when they first start trying to polish an Octagon barrel, make them kind of a half round, half octagon, and not half of the barrel being round and half being octagon, but the whole thing being kind of just rounded off. So basically what we're going to do is I'm going to start on the bottom flat. So there's something wrong with my setup. I'm working on the flat that's going to be the least visible. And I can make the changes and not screw up, say, like the top flat that is the most visible and has the markings on it. And we're probably going to lose the markings on this one and have to have it remarked anyway, but we'll save them as best we can. The caliber mark still looks pretty good, but the barrel address is pretty light. So rather than start off with draw filing, we're going to start off with 150 grit sandpaper, of course backed, and just see what we've got. Now we really want to be careful about being absolutely flat. And so as we start polishing here, we're going to see what kind of defects present themselves. And if we're going to have to go to draw filing. And we try to avoid draw filing if we can. Draw filing, if we've got deep pits or even medium pits, we're going to have to draw file them out. It's just a matter of the most efficient way to do it. But of course, draw filing leaves pretty deep scratches, and it's going to take more polishing to get those draw filing marks out. We can see on this bottom flat here, we'll get you up closer, there are a few pits, but not so bad that we're going to have to draw file that. Now I know there's at least one flat on here that is going to have to be draw filed. Let's get you up here closer. This area right here is probably the worst of the pits on this flat, and they're really not too bad. We should be able to take those out with this 150 grit sandpaper. So we're just going to keep working. And of course with sandpaper we can work in both directions. When we get to the file, we're only going to be filing in one direction. We'll just keep working on it. Now one of the things you'll notice that is our paper starts loading up right away, just like a file will. And we have to take a file card to our files, we have to clean out our paper as well. And that's just a matter of a blue shop towel here. Clean that out a little bit. And then we can make our paper last a little longer by occasionally moving over a little bit. And we'll go over here and use that side. Come back a little bit here, make sure we're staying good and level and flat. And you can see we're working through those pits pretty quickly. And I'm going really slow here just to demonstrate. And we've almost gone through those pits now. And we're keeping our paper pretty clean here. Now in just a few minutes we've almost got this bottom flat completely cleaned up to 150 grit. And this barrel is a little bit different in that the edges on these flats are really crisp. A lot of these old barrels on the older guns that got used a lot, they're really rounded off and a lot of dings and nicks in those edges, and we don't have that here. Whatever that chemical was that took off the finish on this rifle left the flats in good shape. So that makes things a lot easier. We don't have to try to take down the metal to bring those edges back. We're just getting to the bottom of these light pits. Okay, so this first flat cleaned up pretty nicely, and it didn't take very long either because this one wasn't deeply pitted at all. But as we look at this next flat we got started on, we can see that there's a fair amount of pitting, mostly on this upper part of this flat. So we really have to make a decision about whether we just stay with the sandpaper and keep going or start to doing some draw filing. And in this case it's just going to save some time to go to draw filing, so we'll show you the technique for that. Okay, so we're using a brand new 6-inch single cut smooth cut file, and that's the size that I really like. Now one of the big advantages to having this barrel spinner is that we can be off a little bit with our being flat to the barrel, and it'll turn a little bit. I mean, we're not going to ride up on an edge and have it stay there. If you see, that barrel is going to come right back and be flatten itself out. So it's easier to keep those good clean edges. And we're just going to pull full length down here. It sounds like I need to take our autofocus off because it's having trouble keeping up with me there. There we go. Now the big thing when you're draw filing, you pull the thing nice and even and slowly. Now some people like to push when they're draw filing. I don't. I have trouble keeping the thing flat. But the big thing is to keep your file clean. And of course don't throw your file card on the floor. But card that file off every few strokes, because if you get a little chip in that file, it's going to make a gouge, and you're going to have to keep going and clean that gouge out. Now we're getting to the bottom of these pits relatively quickly now. Now if you don't have a barrel spinner and you have trouble keeping it flat, you can always run your file more lengthwise like this and go down. It's much easier to keep your file flat this way than this way. Now we don't change direction like we do on some of the larger parts. It's really hard to go across a flat and keep it good and flat. So, you know, if anything, we just angle that file more, and then we try to angle the cut a little bit so we can see where we've been and make sure we've cleaned up the last pass. Okay, so now we've got a couple of flats done, looking real nice, and we get to the flat that we've been kind of dreading. This one, as we can see, it's got a fair amount of pitting out here, and so we'll just start off with a little 150 grit just to make that pitting stand up, and then go straight to draw filing. Okay, now we've got a pretty good look at those pits, and we can start draw filing them out. Now you'll notice with a single cut file, we're only cutting in one direction. If we were to push this back up in the other direction, we could easily roll those file edges over and dull it very, very quickly. Let's clean that up. Now it's going to take a little bit to get through the bottom of these pits, but they're not terribly deep, but just pretty well widespread down this one flat. Now what you don't want to do is concentrate, say you've got an area of pitting like right in here, just start draw filing here. You create a low spot or a dip, and that line, both lines on either side of that flat are going to have a bow in them, and that's really going to catch the eye. So we've got to go beyond these pits and not start and end in the same place. Of course we can start at the end of the barrel, but don't end down here. It's best to go full length of the barrel all the way down. Okay, so this final step in polishing a barrel and magazine tube for rust blue is something that isn't absolutely necessary, but it's something I like to do. I just take a really, really fine abrasive paper, and I'm talking like 1800 grit. And I'll just go lightly over the top and see what we've done at the 320 grit. We've got some peaks and valleys on the surface of this metal, and we're just going to kind of round those top peaks off, and it's still not going to affect the rust bluing process at all, but it just kind of shines it up and gives it a little bit better look. So we're not, of course, we're not trying to polish to 1800 or we'd never get rust blue to stick, but we're just going to do a very short, just down and back, and call it good. And it's amazing how much difference that makes, just that little down and back with a fine abrasive.
Little final polish work on this Colt. Fortunately, with the polish work, we can't do that by hand.
Now, if you remember where this thing started out, it's pretty amazing what kind of shine we've got on it now. Getting ready for the color case hardening process.
Took right around 8 hours to fully polish her out and get her high buff. I can keep my finger mudges out of it. Now we'll go off to stamping.
Now here's the result of over 15 hours of hand polishing between Josh and I. And we're not done yet. You see, there's still some small parts that have to be polished out. We've got the trigger, the hammer, the loading gate, the dust cover, these little ejector bars. So, you know, we're probably going to be into this 17, 18 hours. It's just very time consuming to do it right. Now the interesting thing is we've got different polishes for 3 different types of finishes that'll go on these parts alone. And so our barrel and magazine tube, which will get rust blued, is to a 320 grit, so not nearly as high a polish as our other parts. Now our receiver here that's going to get color case hardened, typically we'll go to 600. We went a little further on this one just the little extra effort because it's probably going to end up in my wife's collection. So it's a little beyond 600. You see that the little rampant Colt just magically reappeared and looks really good. And then this butt plate here, this was an interesting find from spending time at the Cody Firearms Museum just down the road. That the Colt Burgess lever action rifles had a color case hardened butt plate like the early Winchesters, but the early Colt Lightnings had a charcoal blued butt plate. So we've mirror polished this butt plate and we'll be charcoal bluing it. So we'll show all these three different types of finish as we follow this restoration from beginning to end. Well, thanks for joining us today, and I hope you learned at least a little something about how to properly hand polish firearms for restoration. Now, we can do the same thing a whole lot faster with belt grinders and buffing wheels and pretty much destroy the firearm in the process. If you've been around restored firearms that have been restored poorly in the past, you know what I'm talking about. Rounded edges and screw holes that are all dished out. They just look horrible. But in order to do it right, it takes a lot of patience and a lot of attention to detail. And I hope you've kind of picked up on some of the things that we've learned over the years that have helped us to be able to polish firearms in this way. So I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Stay tuned for future episodes as we follow this restoration to its end. I'm getting pretty excited about it. We've got a little finish work to do. We still got the woodwork to do. And then it's time to take it to the range, my favorite part of gunsmithing. Until next time, happy trails from Wyoming Armory in Cody, Wyoming.